They had marched across Europe as conquering heroes, members of the most feared military machine the world had ever known. Now, in the summer of 1943, thousands of German soldiers found themselves behind barbed wire fences in rural America, staring out at endless fields of wheat, corn, and cotton stretching to the horizon. What broke their faith in final victory wasn't battlefield defeats or propaganda. It was the simple sight of American abundance. While Germany had conscripted every able-bodied man to fight, America still had enough men to till its fields, run its factories, and simultaneously field the largest military force in its history. The sight of American farmers, young, strong men who weren't in uniform, delivering mountains of food to processing centers was more devastating to German morale than any strategic defeat. It was in these quiet moments, watching America's material wealth firsthand, that many German prisoners of war first whispered among themselves, "Der Krieg ist verloren," the war is lost. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now let's get to the story. The United States Department of War faced an unprecedented situation by mid-1943. Nearly 400,000 German prisoners would eventually be transported across the Atlantic to American soil. Men who had been fighting in the deserts of North Africa, the mountains of Italy, and the hedgerows of France. For a nation that had never held enemy prisoners on such a massive scale, this presented both a logistical challenge and an unexpected opportunity. The Geneva Convention required that POWs be housed in similar conditions to the capturing nation's own troops, be paid for labor at the same rate as the capturing nation's soldiers, and be fed the same rations. America, unlike its European allies, had the resources to comply with these requirements fully, and in doing so, inadvertently created one of the most effective psychological operations of the war. The first German POWs arrived in America in May 1942, a small group of 181 men captured in North Africa during the early Allied campaigns against Rommel's Afrika Korps. By the time the North African campaign concluded in May 1943, over 130,000 German and Italian soldiers had surrendered. These prisoners were initially held in temporary camps near the battlefields, but the logistical strain on the British forces in the region made it impossible to house them all. It was decided that many would be transported to America, where food was plentiful and secure facilities could be constructed far from the fighting. The U.S. Army quickly established a Provost Marshal General's Office, PMGO, to oversee what would become one of the largest prisoner relocation programs in modern history. The PMGO selected camp locations primarily in rural areas across the South and Midwest, regions with labor shortages caused by military conscription but abundant agricultural production. By the end of the war, more than 700 POW camps and branch camps had been established in 46 states. Each main camp housed approximately 3,000 prisoners, while smaller branch camps held several hundred men who worked primarily on farms and in food processing facilities. For the German soldiers who had been indoctrinated with visions of American decadence and weakness, the journey to these camps was the first shock. Many had expected to be mistreated, perhaps even executed. Instead, they received medical care, regular meals, and transportation on the same troop ships that had carried American soldiers to Europe. Kurt Pechmann, a young Feldwebel sergeant captured in Tunisia, later recalled, "We were told Americans would treat us brutally. When they gave us the same food as their own soldiers, white bread, meat, even cigarettes, we thought it was propaganda. We expected the real treatment to begin once we were away from witnesses." The second shock came upon arrival in America. As prisoner trains moved inland from coastal debarkation points, Germans pressed against windows, witnessing the American landscape for the first time. They saw no bombed cities, no food lines, no signs of deprivation that had become commonplace in Europe. Instead, they saw small towns with electricity, automobiles on the roads, and civilians who appeared well-fed and well-dressed. Walter Schmid, a former member of the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in his diary, "We passed through Chicago today. Everything functions as if there is no war. Shops full of goods, streets clean and undamaged. How can a country fighting a global war appear so untouched?" For military intelligence officers within the German ranks, the most troubling observations weren't the intact cities or the civilian prosperity. It was America's agricultural capacity. Germany had struggled with food production throughout the war, with much of its agricultural workforce conscripted into military service. By 1943, German civilians were surviving on strict rations, with meat, eggs, and dairy products becoming increasingly scarce. In contrast, the American heartland appeared to be operating at full capacity, with fields of grain stretching to the horizon and modern farm equipment operating with seemingly endless supplies of fuel and parts. The War Department had not planned these observations as psychological warfare. Rather, they were the natural consequence of America's economic might. What followed, however, was more deliberate. Facing severe labor shortages, particularly in agriculture, the government implemented a program allowing POWs to work voluntarily in essential industries. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be required to work in non-dangerous, non-war-related occupations, and they would be paid the equivalent of what American soldiers earned, about 80 cents per day, with some money held in credit until repatriation. By late 1943, approximately 140,000 German POWs were working in American agriculture, food processing, and light industry. For many prisoners, this work program provided their most intimate view of American society and their most profound realization about the war's inevitable outcome. Horst Gunther, a former Wehrmacht radio operator captured in Sicily, was assigned to harvest potatoes in Idaho. In letters smuggled home after the war, he wrote, "The Americans have machinery for everything. One American farmer with his equipment does the work of 20 men in Germany. Their storehouses are overflowing with food, while they claim their civilians face rationing. If this is American hardship, then Germany has been in famine for years without knowing it." Perhaps the most significant psychological impact came from working alongside American civilians. Franz Leitner, captured in Italy with the Hermann Göring Division, worked on a farm near Fort Riley, Kansas. "What broke my faith in victory," he later told American intelligence officers during denazification interviews, "was not the food or the comfortable barracks, but watching American farmers, men of fighting age who were not in uniform. In Germany, we had conscripted every man, even teenagers and the elderly. Here, with so many men already fighting abroad, they still had enough to tend the fields. I realized then that the war was a mathematical impossibility for Germany. This revelation, that America could simultaneously field a massive military while maintaining its civilian economy, contradicted the fundamental Nazi narrative about the war. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda had portrayed Americans as soft, decadent, and unable to sustain the sacrifices necessary for total war. Yet German POWs witnessed firsthand that America was fighting with what appeared to be one hand tied behind its back, committing only a portion of its industrial and human resources to the conflict while maintaining a functioning civilian economy. The War Department recognized the potential of this realization and subtly encouraged it. American newspapers and magazines were made available in POW camps. Special re-education programs were established, ostensibly to prepare prisoners for a post-Nazi Germany. Films showing American industrial production and military campaigns were screened. None of this violated the Geneva Convention's prohibition against forced indoctrination, as participation was voluntary, but it provided a steady stream of information that contradicted Nazi propaganda. The impact varied depending on the prisoners' backgrounds and ideological commitment. The U.S., Military classified German POWs into three categories: white, anti-Nazi; gray, apolitical or moderate; and black, committed Nazis. Among the white and gray prisoners, the American experience often confirmed existing doubts about Nazi leadership. For the black category, the evidence of American power sometimes hardened their resolve, reinforcing the belief that Germany must fight to the last man rather than submit to occupation. Camp 1713 near Salina, Kansas, demonstrated how these dynamics played out. Established in July 1943, it housed primarily Afrika Korps veterans, professional soldiers with strong unit pride, but varying degrees of Nazi ideological commitment. The camp commander, Colonel Charles Horner, implemented a strategy of minimal interference with prisoners' self-governance, allowing the Germans to maintain their military hierarchy within the camp. This approach, controversial at the time, allowed internal divisions to surface naturally. By early 1944, the camp had developed three distinct factions: a small group of ardent Nazis who maintained discipline through intimidation, a larger group of apolitical professionals who followed orders out of habit, and a growing number of prisoners who privately acknowledged Germany's impending defeat. The last group included men like Sergeant Wilhelm Müller, who had witnessed the vast wheat fields of Kansas and concluded, "For every acre of contested soil in Europe, America has 1,000 acres of untouched farmland. They could fight this war for 20 years without feeling what we felt in 4. The turning point for many prisoners came with the D-Day landings in June 1944. News of the successful Allied invasion of France reached the POW camps through approved newspaper and radio reports. The Nazi faction dismissed these reports as propaganda, but prisoners working outside the camps could confirm the news through conversations with civilians and observation of increased activity at nearby military installations. The mathematical reality of a two-front war against enemies with superior resources became undeniable. In Camp Concordia, Kansas, this realization led to a near revolt against Nazi leadership within the prisoner hierarchy. A group of officers who had served on the Eastern Front calculated that Germany could not possibly redeploy enough forces from Russia to repel the Western Allies while simultaneously holding back the Soviet advance. When confronted with these assessments, the camp's senior Nazi ideologue, Captain Heinrich Weber, responded by organizing a nighttime tribunal that labeled the officers defeatists. 3 were severely beaten before American guards intervened. This incident highlighted the War Department's delicate balance between allowing prisoner self-governance and preventing Nazi intimidation. After similar incidents across multiple camps, the military implemented a more aggressive segregation policy, isolating identified Nazi leaders and providing greater protection for prisoners who rejected Nazi ideology. This policy, while protecting vulnerable prisoners, also served intelligence purposes. It allowed American authorities to identify and cultivate potential collaborators for post-war reconstruction. The agricultural work program expanded significantly in 1944 as labor shortages intensified. With approximately 11.5 million Americans now in uniform, farm communities faced an existential labor crisis during harvest seasons. German POWs increasingly filled this gap, working in fields, canneries, and food processing plants across rural America. By the fall of 1944, prisoners were responsible for harvesting or processing a significant percentage of the potato crop in Maine, the apple crop in Michigan, the cotton crop in Arkansas, and the wheat crop across the Great Plains states. This agricultural labor became the most powerful demonstration of America's capacity to wage war while maintaining domestic production. Karl-Heinz Richter, a former Hitler Youth leader captured in Normandy, was assigned to cotton harvesting in Arkansas. His wartime diary, confiscated during repatriation but preserved in National Archives records, shows his psychological journey. July 1944. Americans claim they have landed in Normandy. The guards are excited, but it must be exaggerated. Germany will throw them back into the sea. By October, his entries had changed dramatically. The cotton harvest is massive. Train cars full, day after day. The Americans used German prisoners, Mexican workers, women, and old men. Yet they harvest more than all of Europe combined. I am beginning to question everything we were told. Perhaps the most profound impact of the POW labor program occurred during the winter of 1944-45, as news of the Battle of the Bulge reached the camps. Germany's last major offensive had been portrayed by Nazi loyalists within the camps as the beginning of a great reversal of fortune. Yet prisoners working outside the camps could track the battle's progress through newspapers and conversations with civilians, witnessing America's rapid recovery and counterattack without any apparent strain on the domestic economy. Food production continued uninterrupted. Factory output remained steady. The Christmas season proceeded with well-stocked stores and public celebrations. For men like Erich Arendt, a Luftwaffe gunner captured in France, this disconnect became impossible to reconcile with Nazi propaganda. Working in a meat processing plant in Nebraska, he watched as local farmers delivered record numbers of cattle for slaughter, even as they complained about fuel rationing. The Americans consider it a hardship to drive their cars only for necessary trips, he wrote to his brother in a letter confiscated by censors but preserved in military intelligence files. Their version of food rationing would be considered abundance in Germany. When I heard civilians complain about only having beef twice weekly while still sending millions of cans to their troops and allies, I knew everything we had been told was a lie. As 1945 began, the psychological transformation among many German POWs accelerated. News of Allied advances on both fronts, confirmed by multiple sources, made Germany's defeat seem inevitable to all but the most dedicated Nazi ideologues. In camps across America, a quiet but profound shift occurred. Prisoners began preparing for a post-war world, one in which Germany would be occupied and Nazi ideology discredited. Language classes became more popular. Prisoners requested books on American history and government. Some even began writing manifestos for a democratic Germany, circulated secretly to avoid retribution from Nazi loyalists who maintained influence in many camps. This transformation did not go unnoticed by American military intelligence. The Provost Marshal General's Office expanded its Special Projects Division, a euphemistically named section responsible for identifying prisoners who might be useful in post-war Germany. By February 1945, this division was conducting extensive interviews with selected POWs, assessing their political reliability and potential value for occupation administration. These efforts, while still respecting Geneva Convention limitations on indoctrination, laid the groundwork for what would become the Intellectual Diversion Program, an accelerated effort to prepare cooperative prisoners for roles in post-Nazi Germany. As the European War entered its final months, the contrast between conditions in POW camps and reports from Germany became stark. Prisoners received letters from family members describing food shortages, bombing raids, and the collapsing German infrastructure. Meanwhile, they continued to work in America's fields and factories, witnessing a society that appeared untouched by the war's deprivations. This contrast created what psychologists later termed survivor's guilt among many prisoners who struggled to reconcile their relative comfort with the suffering of their families in Germany. The suicide of Walter Strauss, a 37-year-old former schoolteacher captured in Tunisia, highlighted this psychological strain. In March 1945, after receiving a letter informing him that his wife and children had been killed in an Allied bombing raid on Dresden, Strauss hanged himself in Camp Breckenridge, Kentucky. His suicide note, preserved in military records, reads in part, "I have eaten well while my family starved. I have slept in warmth while they froze. I have watched America's endless bounty while my homeland is reduced to rubble. God forgive me for not being with them at the end." Yet for other prisoners, America's abundance provided hope rather than guilt, evidence that Germany could recover under similar political and economic systems. As Allied forces pressed deeper into Germany, releasing photographs of concentration camps and other Nazi atrocities, many prisoners faced a painful reckoning with their nation's actions. For some, America's democratic capitalism offered a potential path forward, a model for rebuilding from the moral and physical ruins of the Third Reich. This sentiment was particularly strong among younger prisoners like Reinhard Schultz, a 20-year-old draftee captured in Italy. Working on dairy farms in Wisconsin, Schultz developed a close relationship with his American employer, learning English and studying agricultural techniques. In an application for the camp's educational program, he wrote, "I see now that strength comes not from conquering others, but from building something that benefits all. America's farms produce more because the farmers work for themselves, not for the state. This is the system Germany needs after Hitler, not communism, not fascism, but freedom to build and grow without government controlling every decision." As spring arrived in 1945, bringing news of Germany's collapsing defenses on all fronts, the mood in POW camps shifted from resignation to anticipation. Prisoners began to focus on the practical questions of post-war life. When would they be repatriated? What would they find upon returning to Germany? Would they face punishment for their military service? The American authorities, sensing this shift, expanded educational and vocational programs designed to prepare prisoners for civilian life. The announcement of Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, brought mixed reactions in the camps. There were scattered celebrations among prisoners who had privately opposed Hitler, but the predominant response was quiet relief that the fighting had ended, tempered by uncertainty about Germany's future. In the days following the surrender, many camps held memorial services for fallen comrades on both sides, reflecting the complex emotions of men who had fought for a defeated cause they now questioned. For the American authorities, VE Day marked a transition in the POW program's purpose. With the fighting ended, the emphasis shifted from security and intelligence gathering to preparation for eventual repatriation. The War Department, in cooperation with the State Department, developed an accelerated re-education program aimed at exposing prisoners to democratic principles without violating Geneva Convention restrictions on political indoctrination. This program, controversial at the time, included voluntary classes in American history and government, screenings of films documenting Nazi atrocities, and the publication of a German-language newspaper called Der Ruf, The Call, written primarily by anti-Nazi prisoners. While participation remained voluntary, camp administrators created incentives for attendance, including preferred work assignments and recreational privileges. The impact of these formal programs, however, was arguably less significant than the continued influence of working among American civilians. As the summer of 1945 progressed, German POWs remained essential to the agricultural labor force, particularly for the fall harvest. Working alongside Americans who had lost sons and husbands in the European fighting, many prisoners experienced unexpected kindness that contradicted Nazi depictions of American hatred and vengefulness. Günther Kessel, a former Waffen-SS soldier who had hidden his unit affiliation from his captors, worked on an Iowa farm owned by a family whose oldest son had been killed in the Battle of Hürtgen Forest. "They knew I was German, they knew their son had died fighting Germans, yet they treated me like a human being," he later recalled in a 1976 oral history interview. "The mother would pack extra food in my lunch. The father taught me to drive his tractor. When I became ill with influenza, they brought medicine from town. This experience changed me more than any re-education lecture could have. I saw the enemy as people, and they saw me the same way." As summer turned to fall in 1945, the attention of both prisoners and their American guards increasingly turned to the Pacific War, where fighting against Japan continued. The POWs followed newspaper accounts of the island-hopping campaign, generally expressing sympathy for American troops while noting with professional interest the differences between the European and Pacific theaters. When news arrived of atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, followed by Japan's surrender, many prisoners recognized they were witnessing the birth of a new global order, one in which America's technical and industrial superiority would be decisive. This recognition informed discussions about Germany's future that occurred throughout the POW camp system. While some prisoners remained committed to nationalist ideologies, a growing number embraced the idea of a new Germany integrated into a Western alliance system. Friedrich Kellner, a former Wehrmacht communications officer held in Texas, organized informal future circles in which prisoners debated post-war scenarios. Notes from these discussions, preserved by participants, show a sophisticated understanding of emerging Cold War dynamics. If America withdraws, as after the last war, Russia will dominate all of Europe. Germany's only hope is to become valuable to the Americans as a buffer against Bolshevism. We must rebuild as a democratic state allied with the West, not because of idealism, but for survival. By late 1945, repatriation had become the dominant concern among prisoners. Under Geneva Convention provisions, POWs were to be returned to their home countries as soon as possible after the conclusion of peace. But the absence of a formal peace treaty with a functioning German government complicated this requirement. The Allied powers, recognizing the chaos in occupied Germany, developed a phased repatriation plan based on several factors, including the prisoners' political reliability, specialized skills needed for reconstruction, and the capacity of occupation zones to absorb returnees. The first German POWs to leave America were those classified as ardent Nazis, who were transferred to European camps for denazification proceedings. Next came prisoners with medical conditions requiring repatriation on humanitarian grounds. The majority, however, remained in America throughout the fall and winter of 1945-46, continuing to provide agricultural and industrial labor during the economic transition from wartime to peacetime production. For American communities that had come to rely on POW labor, this gradual repatriation process created complex emotions. Local farmers and business owners often developed professional respect and even personal friendships with prisoners who had worked for them for up to 3 years. In many communities, there were unofficial farewell gatherings as prisoners prepared for repatriation, events that would have been unthinkable when the captives first arrived as feared enemies. Robert Miller, a wheat farmer near Hays, Kansas, expressed this transformation in a letter to his congressman opposing accelerated repatriation. The 5 German boys who have worked my field since 1943 have become like family. They work hard, they've learned our methods, and they've come to understand our way of life. Sending them back to a destroyed Germany seems almost cruel. If there were a way to let them stay and become Americans, I would sponsor them in a heartbeat. Such sentiments reflected a broader shift in American attitudes toward Germans, from wartime enemies to potential Cold War allies. This shift, occurring first in communities with direct exposure to POWs, anticipated the national policy realignment that would culminate in the Marshall Plan and the formation of NATO. While high-level strategists in Washington debated containment policy, farmers in Kansas and factory owners in Alabama were already reconceptualizing former enemies as potential partners in rebuilding a democratic Europe. For the prisoners themselves, the prospect of returning to a defeated, divided Germany evoked mixed emotions. Many feared the conditions they would face: food shortages, housing destruction, political instability, and potential retribution from occupying forces, particularly in the Soviet zone. Others worried about the moral reckoning awaiting those who had served in a military now implicated in unprecedented atrocities. Yet, most expressed a determination to participate in rebuilding their homeland, bringing with them the lessons, both practical and philosophical, they had learned in America. Otto Engelhardt, a former Luftwaffe pilot held in Arizona, expressed this determination in a letter to his American camp commander before repatriation. I came to this country a convinced National Socialist, believing Germany's destiny was to rule Europe. I return a changed man, having seen that true strength lies not in conquest but in production, not in racial purity but in cooperation across differences. What impressed me most was not America's military might, but its farms and factories. While we devoted everything to war, you created abundance that made war merely one of many national priorities. I will tell this truth to everyone who will listen in the new Germany. As 1946 progressed, the POW camps gradually emptied. By June, fewer than 100,000 German prisoners remained in America. Those still held were primarily skilled workers retained for specific labor programs, men whose home regions lay in the Soviet occupation zone, and whose repatriation was complicated by emerging Cold War tensions, and a small number who had been implicated in war crimes and awaited trial or transfer to European authorities. The final phase of the POW program highlighted its long-term significance for both American foreign policy and individual prisoners' lives. As the Cold War solidified into a defining global conflict, American military and diplomatic officials increasingly viewed the POW experience as an opportunity for long-term influence. The Special Projects Division of the Provost Marshal General's Office maintained records on prisoners who had demonstrated leadership qualities and democratic inclinations, men who might become influential in post-war Germany. This strategic assessment proved prescient. In subsequent decades, former POWs would play significant roles in West Germany's democratic development. Men who had harvested American wheat became agricultural administrators, implementing modern farming techniques. Former officers who had studied American constitutional principles helped draft local government charters. Technicians who had worked in American factories returned with knowledge that contributed to Germany's economic miracle. Beyond these institutional influences, the POW experience created thousands of informal ambassadors for American culture and economic systems. Men like Eric Weber, who had worked on a Minnesota dairy farm, returned to the Rhineland with plans for modernizing agricultural methods. In a 1962 interview with an American journalist, Weber explained, "I built my successful dairy business on what I learned as a prisoner." The Americans didn't realize they were training their future competitors, but perhaps that was their greatest victory, creating a world where we compete in markets rather than on battlefields. For many former prisoners, the POW experience represented a profound personal transformation, from soldiers in a totalitarian system to citizens of a democratic one. This transformation rarely followed the straight line envisioned by American re-education programs. It occurred gradually through observations of American abundance, conversations with civilian employers, and the slow recognition that democratic capitalism produced material benefits that nationalist militarism could not match. Perhaps the most telling evidence of this transformation came from an unexpected source: tourism statistics from the 1950s and 1960s. As West Germany's economic recovery created a middle class with disposable income for international travel, a disproportionate number of former POWs returned to America as tourists, often visiting the communities where they had been held captive. Local newspapers across the country carried stories of emotional reunions between former prisoners and the farmers or factory owners who had once employed them. These visits represented more than nostalgia. They demonstrated how completely the perception of America had changed among men who had once fought against it. Having witnessed American abundance firsthand, they had returned to help build a German society that embraced similar principles of democratic governance and market economics. The sight of men still farming America's fields while others fought its wars, once a shocking revelation of American power, had become a model for their own nation's development. The final German prisoners of war left American soil in July 1946, marking the end of a remarkable chapter in military history. What had begun as a logistical necessity housing captured enemy soldiers far from the battlefields, had evolved into something more significant, a vast experiment in cultural exchange that would influence both nations for decades to come. As the former prisoners reintegrated into German society, they carried with them memories of American abundance that contrasted sharply with the devastation they found at home. Ruins stretched across German cities. Food remained scarce. The once powerful nation was now divided into occupation zones, its future uncertain. Against this backdrop of destruction, the lessons learned in American POW camps took on new significance. The immediate post-war period presented former POWs with challenges that tested their resilience and shaped their perspectives on the American experience. Men who had spent years in the relative comfort of American camps returned to find families living in damaged buildings without adequate heating, plumbing, or reliable food supplies. The contrast between American abundance and German scarcity, once a shock that undermined faith in Nazi propaganda, now became a painful daily reality. Hans Berliner, who had harvested corn in Nebraska, returned to find his family's Berlin apartment destroyed and his parents living in a converted railway car. In America, I had hot water, meat with every meal, and a warm barracks, he wrote in his memoir. My first night home, I slept on the floor of a room with a hole where the wall should have been, sharing one blanket with my father and brother. I had expected conditions to be bad, but the reality exceeded even my darkest imagination. The reception former POWs received varied dramatically depending on which occupation zone they returned to. Those repatriated to American, British, and French zones generally experienced straightforward processing, with cursory denazification screenings followed by release to civilian status. The approximately 30,000 prisoners whose homes lay in the Soviet occupation zone faced more difficult circumstances. Soviet authorities viewed returning Wehrmacht veterans with deep suspicion, subjecting them to intensive interrogation, and in many cases, redirecting them to forced labor camps in the Soviet Union. Approximately 15% of German POWs from American camps who returned to the Soviet zone were subsequently transferred to Soviet labor camps, where conditions were dramatically worse than those they had experienced in America. This disparity created an immediate object lesson in competing systems that reinforced the observations many prisoners had made about American society. Former POWs in Western occupation zones found themselves courted rather than persecuted by military governments that recognized their potential value in rebuilding a democratic Germany. The Counterintelligence Corps of the U.S. Army actively recruited former prisoners who had demonstrated anti-Nazi sentiments, employing them as informants, translators, and liaisons with the German population. These opportunities reinforced the impression that America valued competence and cooperation above ideology, a sharp contrast to both Nazi Germany and the emerging Soviet system. The material conditions in occupied Germany provided a second reinforcement of lessons learned in America. Food shortages remained severe throughout 1946 and 1947, with average daily caloric intake in urban areas falling as low as 1,000 calories per person, less than half the American POW ration. Former prisoners with agricultural experience found themselves in high demand as occupation authorities sought to revitalize food production using modern techniques. Men who had worked on American farms brought valuable knowledge about mechanized agriculture, crop rotation, and efficient harvesting methods, expertise that took on life-or-death significance in the hungry post-war years. Walter Griesbach, who had worked on wheat farms in Kansas, exemplified this knowledge transfer. Returning to his family's small farm near Hanover, he implemented techniques he had observed in America: contour plowing to prevent erosion, careful seed selection, and more efficient field layouts. His farm's productivity increased by nearly 40% within 2 years, attracting attention from neighbors and eventually from British occupation authorities, who employed him as an agricultural advisor for the region. In a 1949 report to the British Agricultural Commission, Griesbach credited his POW experience. "What I learned working as a prisoner in America saved my family from starvation and now helps my community." The Americans showed us not just how to grow more food, but how a society can organize itself to create abundance rather than scarcity. Beyond specific technical knowledge, former POWs brought back a broader understanding of American economic organization that influenced Germany's post-war reconstruction. Men who had worked in American factories had observed management techniques, labor relations, and production methods that contrasted with Germany's more hierarchical industrial traditions. This exposure contributed to the evolving concept of the social market economy, Sozialmarktwirtschaft, that would become West Germany's economic model, combining free market principles with strong social protections. Friedrich Holzapfel, a former Luftwaffe mechanic who had worked in an aircraft parts factory in Connecticut, became a labor organizer in the Ruhr industrial region after repatriation. In negotiations with British occupation authorities and German industrialists, he advocated for what he called the American balance, protecting workers' rights while maintaining flexible production systems. "In the American factory, I saw how workers could have both security and incentive," he explained in a 1951 speech to union members. "The mistake of our past was to believe these must be in opposition. We can build an economy that is both productive, like America's, and socially responsible in our own tradition." The political impact of the POW experience manifested more gradually, but proved equally significant. In the initial post-war elections, former prisoners did not vote as a unified bloc. Their political choices reflected regional traditions, religious affiliations, and personal experiences beyond their time in America. However, research by German political scientists in the 1950s identified a notable trend. Former POWs from American camps were significantly more likely than the general population to support centrist democratic parties and to reject both communist and neo-fascist movements. This pattern held true across educational levels and pre-war political affiliations, suggesting that the American experience had genuinely influenced political perspectives. This influence was particularly evident in local politics, where former POWs frequently emerged as community leaders during Germany's democratic reconstruction. Men who had observed American local government through conversations with employers, newspaper reading, and educational programs in the camps applied these observations to rebuilding civic institutions in their hometowns. In Bavaria alone, more than 200 former POWs served as mayors or town council members by 1950, implementing governance structures that combined American-style pragmatism with German administrative traditions. Anton Weber, who had harvested apples in Washington state, became mayor of a small town near Munich in 1948. In his inaugural address, he explicitly referenced his POW experience. "I saw in America that a community functions best when citizens take responsibility rather than waiting for orders from above. For too long, we Germans believed that good government meant strong authority. Now we must learn that true strength comes from the involvement of ordinary people in decisions that affect their lives." The American influence extended beyond formal governance to civic organizations that formed the backbone of democratic culture. Former POWs were disproportionately represented in the leadership of sports clubs, professional associations, and community service organizations that flourished in post-war West Germany. These voluntary associations, Verein, created spaces for democratic participation outside formal politics, building the social capital necessary for stable democracy. The organizational skills many prisoners had developed in camp self-governance transferred naturally to these civic roles. This transfer of democratic practices reflected one of the most successful aspects of the American POW program, its balance between security requirements and respect for prisoners' agency. By allowing German prisoners to maintain their military hierarchy within the camps while monitoring for Nazi intimidation, American authorities had preserved the organizational skills that would later serve Reconstruction efforts. Prisoners who had served on camp committees, organizing work details, recreational activities, and educational programs, returned with practical experience in democratic decision-making that proved valuable in rebuilding civil society. The generational aspect of this influence cannot be overstated. Most German POWs were young men, averaging 25 years of age, who would go on to play active roles in German society for decades after the war. As they advanced in their careers through the 1950s and 1960s, they carried the lessons of their American experience into leadership positions across West German institutions. Former prisoners became university professors, government officials, business executives, and cultural figures, positions from which they influenced Germany's evolving national identity. Ernst Wagner exemplified this long-term impact. Captured in North Africa as a 22-year-old tank commander, he spent 3 years working in Colorado agricultural programs. After repatriation, he studied agricultural economics, eventually becoming a senior official in the West German Ministry of Agriculture by 1965. In that position, he helped implement the European Economic Community's Common Agricultural Policy, bringing American-influenced ideas about efficient food production to European integration efforts. My years as a prisoner gave me an education no university could provide. He later recalled in his memoirs, "I learned not just farming techniques, but an entire philosophy of organization, how to balance individual initiative with collective goals. These principles guided my approach to both national and European agricultural policy." The cultural impact of the POW experience extended beyond economics and politics into broader questions of national identity and international relations. Men who had experienced America firsthand returned with perspectives that complicated the simplistic narratives of both Nazi propaganda and emerging Cold War rhetoric. They had seen America's strengths and weaknesses up close, developing nuanced views that influenced West Germany's relationship with its new superpower ally. This nuance appeared in literary works by former POWs that contributed to Germany's post-war cultural renaissance. The most notable was Alfred Anders's novel The Cherries of Freedom, 1952, drawn partly from his experiences in American captivity. Anders, who had been an anti-Nazi before his capture, used the American landscape as a metaphor for freedom, vast open spaces contrasting with the psychological and physical confinement of Nazi Germany. Yet he also portrayed the POW experience as a moral testing ground, where individual Germans confronted their complicity in the Nazi system, a theme that resonated with Germany's broader struggle for historical reckoning. Less literary, but more widely read, were the numerous memoirs published by former prisoners in the 1950s. These personal accounts, with titles like 3 Years Behind Uncle Sam's Barbed Wire and From Africa Corps to American Harvest Helper, found eager audiences among Germans curious about America. While quality and perspective varied widely, most shared a common narrative arc: initial fear and hostility giving way to surprise at American conditions, followed by gradual appreciation for American systems, and concluding with reflections on how the experience changed their worldview. These memoirs sold hundreds of thousands of copies, creating a significant channel for American influence in post-war German culture. For many German readers who had never traveled abroad, these first-hand accounts provided their first non-propagandistic glimpse of American society. The descriptions of material abundance, hot water, abundant food, modern machinery influenced consumer aspirations during Germany's economic recovery, contributing to the embrace of American-style consumer culture that characterized the economic miracle years. Beyond published accounts, former POWs served as informal cultural interpreters in their communities. As America established its military presence in West Germany during the Cold War, former prisoners often facilitated interactions between American personnel and local populations. Their language skills, familiarity with American customs, and generally positive associations with their captivity made them natural intermediaries. In communities near American bases, it was common for former POWs to establish businesses catering to American personnel, drawing on their understanding of American preferences and expectations. Eric Neubert, who had worked in a camp canteen in Texas, opened one of the first hamburger restaurants in Kaiserslautern after the establishment of nearby American military facilities. "I knew what real American food tasted like," he explained in a local newspaper interview. "The Americans stationed here wanted a taste of home, and I knew how to provide it." By the mid-1950s, his restaurant had become a popular gathering place for both American servicemen and German youth interested in American culture, creating a space for informal cultural exchange that supplemented official German-American friendship programs. The relationship between former POWs and American occupation forces revealed the program's long-term strategic value for American foreign policy. As Cold War tensions escalated, American military planners recognized that former prisoners constituted a valuable reservoir of goodwill within the German population. These men had experienced American society positively during wartime, when hostility would have been natural, and therefore were predisposed to trust American leadership during the occupation and NATO alliance formation. The Strategic Services Unit, SSU, predecessor to the CIA, explicitly identified former POWs as potential assets in its early Cold War planning. A 1947 intelligence assessment titled Attitudinal Patterns Among Repatriated German POWs concluded, "Former prisoners of war held in American camps represent the demographic most consistently favorable to U.S. policy objectives in occupied Germany." Their first-hand experience of American society inoculated them against Soviet propaganda depicting Americans as imperialist warmongers. They constitute a valuable cohort of informal ambassadors who can influence broader German public opinion toward pro-American positions. This assessment proved accurate, as Cold War dynamics intensified following the Berlin blockade 1948-49 and the formation of two German states in 1949. Former POWs consistently expressed higher levels of support for West German integration into Western security structures than the general population. When surveyed about the establishment of American military bases in West Germany, former prisoners were twice as likely as other Germans to view the American presence positively, a crucial factor in a period when anti-occupation sentiment remained strong in many communities. The former prisoners' pro-American orientation was not merely the result of positive treatment during captivity. More fundamentally, it reflected their first-hand observation of America's industrial and agricultural capacity, power they had witnessed in non-military contexts. Having seen America's ability to maintain civilian production while fighting a global war, they understood the fundamental asymmetry between Western and Soviet economic systems in a way that many Europeans grasping for neutrality did not. Their support for Western integration stemmed not from ideological indoctrination, but from pragmatic assessment of American capabilities they had observed directly. This pragmatism characterized West Germany's emerging foreign policy consensus under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, who prioritized Western integration over reunification throughout the 1950s. Former POWs provided a core constituency for this approach, supporting parties aligned with Adenauer's pro-Western orientation. Their influence was particularly notable in rural areas, where returning prisoners often held respected positions in agricultural cooperatives, local government, and community organizations, platforms from which they could share their American experiences and counter Soviet propaganda. The Soviet authorities recognized this influence and took measures to counter it. In East Germany, returning POWs from American camps faced particular scrutiny from state security services. The Stasi maintained special files on these men, monitoring their communications and restricting their employment opportunities. Those who spoke positively about their American experiences risked accusations of being American agents or fascist sympathizers, paradoxical charges that nonetheless carried serious consequences in the emerging surveillance state. Despite these pressures, former POWs in East Germany often maintained private networks where American experiences were shared more honestly. Johanna Kraus, whose husband had been held in Texas, recalled in a post-reunification interview, "My husband would only speak about America when trusted friends visited. He would close the curtains and lower his voice, then tell stories about the huge farms, the kind treatment, and especially the black soldiers who guarded them but shared their cigarettes. These stories were dangerous knowledge in our village, where the party officials insisted America was a place of poverty and racism." As the 1950s progressed, former POWs became increasingly integrated into West Germany's economic miracle. The practical skills many had acquired in America, from mechanical repair to food processing techniques, proved valuable in an economy transitioning from basic reconstruction to industrial expansion. Men who had worked in American factories applied production methods they had observed, contributing to the modernization of German manufacturing. Those with agricultural experience implemented American farming techniques, helping to transform West German agriculture from subsistence-focused to commercially oriented. The knowledge transfer was not limited to technical skills. Former prisoners also brought back American approaches to management, marketing, and customer service that influenced West German business culture. Having worked in American enterprises during labor shortages, they had observed flatter hierarchies, more collaborative decision-making, and greater emphasis on worker initiative than traditional German businesses had encouraged. These observations influenced management practices as former POWs advanced to leadership positions in the expanding economy. Wilhelm Müller, who had worked in a furniture factory in North Carolina, became a production manager at a similar facility near Stuttgart in the 1950s. He deliberately implemented what he called the American shop floor model, giving workers more autonomy, encouraging suggestions for efficiency improvements, and creating informal communication channels across hierarchical levels. In the American factory, even as a prisoner, I was asked for my ideas to improve production, he explained to a business journal. This respect for workers' knowledge produces both better furniture and more satisfied employees. Germany's future prosperity depends on combining our traditional thoroughness with American flexibility. The POW experience influenced not just how former prisoners worked, but where they chose to live. Men who had developed positive associations with rural America during agricultural work assignments often preferred to settle in similar environments after repatriation. A 1960 demographic study found that former POWs were significantly more likely than other veterans to relocate from cities to small towns and rural areas following the war, a pattern that contributed to the revitalization of rural communities in West Germany. This rural preference reflected practical considerations. Food was more accessible in farming communities during the hungry years, but also philosophical shifts. Many former prisoners had observed that American rural communities maintained stronger democratic traditions and greater self-sufficiency than urban areas. They sought to recreate these qualities in their own lives, establishing homesteads and small businesses in rural districts where they could achieve a degree of independence from both government control and economic uncertainty. Hans Brecher, who had worked on dairy farms in Wisconsin, exemplified this pattern. Returning to his hometown of Cologne in 1947, he found the bombed city psychologically oppressive and food supplies unreliable. Within 6 months, he had relocated his family to a small village in the Eifel region, where he established a cheese-making operation using techniques he had learned in America. In Wisconsin, I saw how a farming community could prosper through cooperation and innovation, he later explained. I wanted this for my children, not just food security, but a way of life where a man can build something meaningful with his own hands. As West Germany stabilized politically and economically through the 1950s, the practical impact of the POW experience gradually gave way to symbolic and memorial dimensions. Former prisoners established veterans associations organized around their camp experiences, holding regular reunions where they maintained connections and shared updates on their post-war lives. These gatherings, initially focused on practical assistance for reintegration, evolved into commemorations that preserved the POW experience as part of Germany's complex war memory. The largest such organization, the Association of Former German Prisoners of War in America, held its first national convention in Bonn in 1958, attracting over 2,000 participants. The organization maintained a dual mission, preserving accurate historical memory of the POW experience and promoting German-American friendship in the contemporary context. Its publications emphasized the humane treatment prisoners had received, presenting the POW program as an early example of reconciliation that anticipated the post-war alliance. This narrative aligned with broader trends in West German memory culture, which increasingly distinguished between the Nazi regime, portrayed as criminal, and the German military, portrayed as professional soldiers fulfilling their duty. Former POWs could present their captivity as honorable service, followed by fair treatment, a clean aspect of the war experience that contrasted with more morally compromised chapters of German military history. This framing helped integrate the POW experience into acceptable public memory at a time when many aspects of the war remained difficult to discuss openly. The American government recognized the diplomatic value of these positive associations and actively cultivated relationships with former POW organizations. The U.S. Embassy in Bonn maintained a dedicated liaison officer for Veterans Affairs who coordinated with former prisoner groups, arranging cultural exchanges, speaking engagements, and commemorative events. American military bases in Germany regularly hosted former POWs for Friendship Days, creating photo opportunities that symbolized reconciliation between former enemies. These symbolic gestures took on greater significance as Cold War competition intensified in the late 1950s and early 1960s. With the Berlin Wall's construction in 1961 physically dividing Germany, West German-American relations assumed existential importance for the Federal Republic. Former POWs became valuable advocates for the alliance, their personal stories of American fairness countering Soviet propaganda about American imperialism and militarism. Perhaps the most powerful such testimony came during the Berlin crisis of 1961, when Soviet pressure and American counter-mobilization created fears of potential conflict. As anti-American protests, organized by left-wing groups, occurred in several West German cities, former POW organizations issued public statements supporting the American military presence. Their newspaper advertisements featured testimonials from men who had experienced both German-Soviet and German-American confrontation, offering personal witness to the moral distinction between the competing systems. I fought against the Americans in North Africa and was treated with dignity when captured, wrote Hauptmann Captain Karl Werner, formerly of the Afrika Korps, in a widely reprinted open letter. I fought against the Russians at Stalingrad and saw my comrades who surrendered marched to death in the snow. Germans who question which system better represents human values should speak to those of us who have experienced both firsthand. America stands with us as friends today. Russia stands against us as they did in 1945. As the immediate post-war generation began passing leadership positions to younger Germans in the 1960s, the direct influence of the POW experience in American camps gradually diminished. Yet its legacy continued through institutions, practices, and relationships these men had established during Germany's Reconstruction. The democratic institutions they had helped build, the management approaches they had implemented, and the international partnerships they had fostered continued shaping West German society long after their personal influence had peaked. This institutional legacy was particularly evident in education, where former POWs who had participated in camp study programs went on to influence West German curriculum development. Many became teachers, university professors, and education administrators, positions from which they could implement approaches to civic education they had first encountered in American camps. The emphasis on participatory learning, open discussion of controversial issues, and critical thinking that characterized West German education reforms in the 1960s reflected methodologies these educators had experienced during their captivity. The agricultural sector provided another enduring legacy. The modernization of West German farming, from predominantly small-scale family operations to more mechanized, commercially oriented enterprises, was significantly influenced by former prisoners who had observed American agricultural methods. Cooperative purchasing associations, equipment sharing arrangements, and regional marketing organizations established by former POWs in the 1950s remained operational decades later, continuing to apply principles first observed on American farms during captivity. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact came through personal relationships that spanned the Atlantic. Beginning in the late 1950s, when civilian travel between Germany and America became more accessible, hundreds of former POWs returned to visit the communities where they had been held captive. These visits, often covered by local newspapers in both countries, created emotional human interest stories that reinforced the narrative of successful reconciliation between former enemies. Typical was the experience of Heinrich Müller, who had worked on a family farm near Salina, Kansas, during his captivity. In 1964, he returned with his wife and teenage children to visit the Anderson family, his former employers. The Salina Journal chronicled the reunion with photographs showing Müller operating the same tractor he had driven as a prisoner, now accompanied by the Anderson son, who had been a child during the war. "He was never really our prisoner," Mrs. Anderson told the reporter. "He became part of our family during a difficult time when all the local boys were overseas. We've exchanged Christmas cards every year since he went home." Such personal connections created thousands of informal ambassadors, maintaining German-American friendship during periods of political tension. When anti-American sentiment surged among younger Germans during the Vietnam War era, these personal relationships provided countering perspectives based on direct experience rather than ideology. Former POWs often found themselves defending American society, if not always American foreign policy, to their children's generation, sharing stories of American openness, fairness, and pragmatism that complicated anti-American narratives. As the former prisoners reached retirement age in the 1970s and 1980s, many devoted their newfound leisure to preserving the history of their wartime experiences. Local historical societies across Germany collected oral histories, photographs, and artifacts documenting the POW experience in America. These efforts, initially scattered and informal, gained institutional support in the 1980s as museums and archives recognized the historical significance of the POW program for German-American relations. The Wehrmacht exhibition controversy of the late 1990s, which publicly documented German military complicity in Nazi crimes, created renewed interest in the POW experience as a counter-narrative emphasizing humanitarian treatment and reconciliation. As German society grappled with more complete acknowledgement of wartime atrocities, the story of fair treatment in American camps offered evidence that international humanitarian law could function even amid total war, a hopeful historical note amid difficult national reckoning. By the early 21st century, few former German POWs remained alive to tell their stories firsthand, yet the legacy of their experience continued shaping German-American relations in subtle ways. The thousands of personal connections they had established, the institutional practices they had influenced, and the cultural attitudes they had helped form created an enduring foundation for transatlantic partnership that survived political disagreements and leadership changes on both sides. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and Germany moved toward reunification, these long-established connections proved valuable in managing the diplomatic complexities of the post-Cold War transition. Former POWs and their descendants, having maintained decades of informal relationships with Americans, provided communication channels that supplemented official diplomacy during a period of rapid geopolitical change. In October 2001, following the September 11th attacks, one of the most moving expressions of German solidarity came from an unexpected source. The Association of Former German POWs in America issued a public statement expressing condolences and support for the American people. "We who once came to America as enemies and were treated with dignity, even in wartime, stand with our American friends in this dark hour," the statement read. "The humanity shown to us as prisoners revealed the true character of America, a nation that upholds human dignity even toward adversaries. This fundamental decency will prevail against those who attack innocent civilians in the name of hatred." This statement from men who had once fought against America exemplified the POW program's most profound legacy: the transformation of enemies into friends through humane treatment and cultural exchange. What began as a pragmatic solution to the logistical problem of housing captured enemy soldiers had evolved into one of history's most successful examples of reconciliation between former adversaries. The German prisoners who realized their nation's defeat by observing America's agricultural abundance had returned home to help build a new Germany aligned with the democratic values and economic practices they had witnessed firsthand. Their experience demonstrated that even amid history's most destructive conflict, seeds of future cooperation could be planted through policies that respected human dignity and demonstrated systemic strengths rather than imposing ideology. As the last generation with direct memory of World War II passes from the scene, the story of German POWs in America offers valuable lessons for contemporary international relations. It demonstrates how adherence to international humanitarian law serves not just moral but strategic purposes, creating foundations for post-conflict reconciliation. It illustrates how cultural exchange, even in constrained circumstances, can transform perceptions more effectively than propaganda. Perhaps most importantly, it shows how individual human connections formed during conflict can ultimately contribute to building a more peaceful international order. The German soldiers who came to America as prisoners returned to Germany as informal ambassadors for a different way of organizing society, one they had observed not through indoctrination, but through direct experience. In fields and factories across America, they had seen the material evidence of democratic capitalism's productive capacity. They had watched as America maintained its civilian economy while fighting a global war, dedicating only a portion of its resources to the conflict. And they had returned to help build a Germany that would incorporate these lessons, becoming a peaceful, prosperous democracy integrated into a Western alliance system that has maintained European stability for over 7 decades. Their story reminds us that even in war's darkest moments, human connections can be formed that ultimately contribute to building peace. The sight of American farmers tending their fields while the nation fought overseas, once a shocking revelation of American power, became a vision of what Germany itself might achieve through similar political and economic organization. What began with the reluctant surrender of defeated soldiers thus developed into one of history's most successful examples of post-conflict reconciliation and reconstruction, a transformation that continued bearing fruit long after the barbed wire came down and the prisoners returned home.